and emerging. In relation to apologies or members on leave of absence, we have apologies from Councillor Rosalind Harley. And I'll now move to public question time. Do you wish to speak? Public question time? No, we have no speakers for public question time, so I declare public question time closed, which brings us to the declarations of interest.
Through you, Mayor Cole, apologies, I'll write this out in a moment, but I have a impartiality interest to disclose in item 6.1. That item relates to Council's appointment of a consultant to conduct my performance review, and therefore I will be affected by the work that the consultant eventually does.
Thank you, CEO. There being no further declarations of interest, we'll move to reports, with the first report being item 5.1, Delegated Authority Register, Local Planning Scheme number 2. Moved Councillor Toppelberg, seconded Councillor Gondaszewski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just firstly, an apology to the Director. I did have a meeting arranged with him earlier today, but I believe he was unwell, and so I haven't had a chance to ask some of these questions prior. So I'll ask them now, and hopefully there's some answers available. So on page 31 of the agenda, so looking at the summary of existing and recommended functions, just in relation to the number 13, which is the non-compliance with the precinct or area policy. And I understand...
Sorry, Councillor Toppelberg, what page of the report are you
Page 31.
On? 31, sorry. Thank you.
So attachment 2, it's within attachment 2. So this relates to... it talks about the 5 objections, but it's saying that the development application will be advertised to the entire design guideline area, just in relation to some of the costs that potentially are associated with that. For instance, if somebody wants to have infill in their fence to allow for services, so a portion of their street-facing fence to include their gas and power meter, am I correct that would then require that to be advertised to the entire precinct in order to comply with the delegation?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. So that would require advertising to the entire design guideline area or character retention area or heritage area. Those areas, though, aren't huge. I've gone through each of them individually. Some of them are very small, and some of them are up to 20, 25, 30 lots. So it's not, I don't think it will be a huge cost to the city to write letters to that area. It was difficult to define those applications that would warrant that kind of advertising and those that wouldn't, because it really depends on, if it's non-compliant with the standards set out in the policy, then some individuals in that community might consider that to be a significant issue, even if it's just for a small portion. So we took the cautious approach and didn't consider there would be a significant cost as a result.
Thank you. And 16, which is on page 32, which deals with the 5 objections. Just for clarity, those objections, so for instance, if a proposed DA is compliant with car parking requirements or with height, for example, and we receive 5 objections that relate to height, even though it's compliant, it'll still trigger the requirement to be reported to council, even though the objections that trigger that number are 100% compliant and aren't a basis on which the report, on which the DA could be refused?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Given this one objection trigger has been removed, I didn't think it was necessary to include the current waiver which sits in the delegations, which says if it's not a valid planning issue that it wouldn't be required to be presented to council. At the moment, the CEO determines whether an issue is a valid issue or not a valid issue, and it's not defined clearly anywhere. And so I was struggling with that, and I have been struggling with it, and we've been presenting everything to council irrelevant of to this point, irrelevant of whether the objections could be argued to be valid or not valid. So I removed that for that reason. It was just vague, and I thought it's much clearer now. If there's more than 5 objections, it comes to council, even if the objections relate to issues that some may argue aren't valid planning issues.
Thank you. On page 34, number 34, So this deals with the ability to delegate for extensions of time. Are you satisfied? Well, I guess you recommended the delegation, so I can probably answer it myself, but I'll ask it anyway. Are you satisfied that and particularly now with a new planning scheme in place, certainly if you look in the DAP environment, I think more than 50% of the applications we've had in the last 12 to 18 months have been for extensions of time, and there's been some contention both with our built form policy and the new scheme and being imminent as to exactly what requirements would apply at the time. Are you comfortable and confident that the extension of time, does this suggest that any DAs that come in that are for extension of time only would only be dealt with under delegation, or would there still be a subjective look at the impact and perhaps the original vote or the community interest in the original DA such that it may come back to council anyway?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the applications will still be advertised, and so that would obviously be one of the factors which would determine whether it comes to council or not. I think there are certainly going to be circumstances where, despite the results of advertising, an item, because of the changes to the built form policy, say in relation to height in particular, would warrant an application being presented to council. But it's very clear now, as a result of some recent SAT decisions, what the matters are that need to be considered by the decision maker in relation to time extensions. I'm satisfied that we now are clear on that process, and we've set that out a number of times in the DAP, and that's the reason it's been recommended that administration determines those time extensions. A lot of them are very minor, some are controversial. Obviously the ones being presented to the DAP are controversial because they are larger applications that have a greater impact. So we're trying to look at the broader scope of applications that come to the city and determined by council. There's a lot of them, and that was the reason for it. It doesn't stop those applications being presented to council in any case if administration considers it appropriate or if we receive more than 5 objections.
And thank you. And just the last question, which is probably a CEO question. We've had a couple of circumstances in recent years where either applicants have requested matters to be determined by council just by request, or elected members, or is there an option for, is there somewhere within our guidelines or within the delegations that gives an applicant the right to request an application to be determined by council regardless of whether it meets the requirements for being dealt with under delegation? And is there an option for elected members, other than general courtesy, is there an option for elected members to call in an application to have it determined by council?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in the first instance, I'm not aware, or I'll turn that into the positive sense. In every instance that I'm aware, an applicant has requested an application be reported to council rather than being determined under delegated authority over the last 4 years. That's always happened, just as a professional courtesy. Administration has always sought to negotiate a sensible outcome with applicants. Often, though, that request has arisen because the applicant was not amenable to the recommendation or the likely decision that staff had notified them was going to be made under delegated authority. So that situation would still remain. I'll have to get the director to clarify whether or not there are any new conditions or exceptions woven into the delegations that expressly state that the delegation cannot be exercised in circumstances where a specific request has been received in writing from the applicant. So I think that's a question more specifically for the director. But on the second point about council members having some kind of call-in power, I don't recall that previously being discussed through consideration of the delegations of authority. But I would state, and it partly addresses an earlier question that you raised, Councillor Toppelberg, that the delegations are discretionary. There is no compulsion on administration to exercise those delegated functions, and there's been a number of instances in the last 4 years that I've been here where delegations have not been exercised, notwithstanding the ability to make a decision, because it was considered that there were significant reasons to require council involvement in the matter, as well as in the public interest at large. So Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm not sure if the Director has any response to that earlier comment.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that request by the applicant to trigger an item being presented to Council is not specifically written into the delegations that have been recommended. But as the CEO has mentioned, it is a consistent practice of the of administration to present those applications to Council where the applicant requests it just out of courtesy.
I guess, sorry, a further question to the CEO then, is that something that you would recommend be formalised in some way in either of those circumstances, or are you comfortable that accepted practice is accepted practice? I guess I can see the double-edged issues that can arise from it, but just, I'll ask it as a question.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think it's more a question that I would ask of Council rather than of the CEO, in that what would Council prefer? If Council is comfortable to rely on, as the Director said, custom and habit and that practice of administration, then the status quo is probably suitable. If, however, Council does want to formalise that so that regardless of custom and habit and practice changing over time, then the best way to do that would be through amendment. I would just, I think it would be more appropriate to give more detailed consideration and discussion with Council members about a call-in power. I've introduced something similar in previous roles that I've been in, but it's been very deliberately crafted in liaison with Council members to just better understand the implications of how and when that might be exercised. So it might not just be one Council member, it might be 3 Council members or whatever the case is, and it might be with certain classes of development applications rather than with any class of development application. But yeah, I think some of that detail needs to be better considered. In relation to the applicant making the request for a matter to be determined by Council instead of under delegated authority, that's a simpler case, and I think if Council wished to formalise that, it could be done by adding a condition or exception to whichever delegation you think that ought to apply to.
Thank you. The other one which I'd denied about, but again we'll ask to the Director, just with the unlisted uses. I guess, so because that need for the absolute majority has disappeared from the scheme, so unlisted, and most of the uses that had been potentially controversial, I suppose, it's not for me to argue with you or to debate with you, but I guess the circumstances under which an unlisted use would potentially have a DA attached to it, or a development application would come in with a use that's not listed in the scheme, would suggest to me that it would likely be something that's out of the ordinary and not been thought of, and therefore would be better determined by Council rather than under delegated authority. It seems odd to me that, because I would say that having all of those uses now listed would mean that anything that's unlisted would perhaps even be more left field, and therefore is something that would perhaps be better determined by Council.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, I'm not clear on what types of applications we're going to see now that are unlisted uses, and they may be significant, they may not be significant. And the basis for their significance, as set out in the delegations, is the number of objections that are received, whether there's parking shortfalls, etc. So that's the trigger that I've relied on in recommending these delegations. I haven't sat down and identified which unlisted uses we've seen over recent times that wouldn't now be listed as a use class in the scheme, and which of those would not have come to Council considering the number of objections received. I can't actually think of any, and so it's hard for me to tell whether they would be of significance or not of significance for Council to consider. I think all of those that aren't listed now as a use, that unlisted uses, would have come to Council in any case because of the number of objections. I think that's how I've arrived at that point.
Okay, thank you. I'll speak very briefly to it. So just in relation to those unlisted uses, for me it's things like potentially delivery drone landing stations, those sorts of things that in the life of our scheme will likely be some of the things that will creep into inner urban areas, and I can name probably a half dozen more of things that you wouldn't think of actually putting into a scheme, but may well become the norm over time. And I do think that trigger of relying on objections to actually bring things to council is a little bit odd, in that it should probably be more so community interest, which can be gauged in the positive and negative. But for now, I'll leave that one as is. But I'll appreciate the responses, and we'll listen to the debate. Thank you.
Nothing further from me. I'm happy with what's presented.
Councillors? Councillor Hallett.
Just a couple of questions through the Mayor to the Director of Development Services. Just wondering about, with the 5 objections as a criteria, 2 things. What I guess is the rationale for 5 as the number versus a lower bar of objections? And then also, when we're doing consultations, do those letters go to both tenants and landowners as well?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. They do go to both tenants or owners and occupiers. In relation to the number, that's been a number that's been used for a significant period of time here at the city, more than 5 objections. The rationale for that, it's as to why that number's used as opposed to some other number 6 or 4 or whatever it may be. I'm not clear on exactly why that number is the key number. That's just something that we've used for a long period of time. It's well established, and I believe that it has ensured that those applications that are of a broader community interest and that would warrant consideration at a full council meeting where the community could participate in the way they do as part of these council meetings, has been successful in achieving that. I think that you could argue that a different number is more appropriate, 6 or 4 or another number, but it's a established number that I think has been successful. So that was the rationale for that being continued.
And just one more. Can I just clarify, just in relation to some of the questions from Councillor Toppelberg around both call-in and then, I guess, an opt-out of delegation by an applicant, is that something that we can bring back at any point in the future through an additional report, even if we leave this as is?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. The delegations are reviewed every year. So every year there's the opportunity through that ordinary process for council to consider that issue. And in addition, at any time, council could request this matter be presented to a full council meeting again, either just through discussions with administration or through a notice of motion and resolution of council. So there's nothing stopping this matter from being reconsidered at any time if council wishes that to be the case.
Sorry, just following on from Councillor Toppelberg's question in relation to unlisted uses and the relationship to whether something would come to council. My reading of the delegations in relation to parking is that the delegations don't extend to parking that have greater shortfall than 5 bays under Table 1 of the parking policy, essentially, unless, and then for shortfalls 5 or less bays, if cash in lieu is to be waived. Under that table, it talks about any other land use. The parking requirements are to be determined on a site-specific parking management plan. Could you just talk me through how that might actually relate to the delegations and referral to council?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's a very good point. The way I've interpreted it when reviewing some recent applications that I've had a look at, I've got an educational establishment that will be presented to council next round, is that those applications will need to be presented to council because there is no parking standard set out in the policy. So I think that's a good point. In any case, unlisted uses will be presented to council because, unlisted uses under the new scheme will be presented to council because they don't have a parking standard under the policy. So I think that issue is addressed through that trigger in any case, it sounds.
Director, I just want to have a question in relation to the category matrix being removed and the uses that will still require the approval of council. I note that in the report on page 7 it doesn't list tavern. Is that just in the report, or is that do the delegations cover tavern? Because that's certainly something that, yeah.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the delegations do list tavern under condition 1.0 as being required to be presented to council. It's not included in that table because it's already listed in an earlier point of the table. I think it is number 5, and it mentions that no change is proposed to that being required to be presented to council.
Okay, thank you. And look, in relation to item 5, in terms of the report and the top 5 changes that are made, it's further to Councillor Toppelberg's question around the delegation to the CEO of the approval of extensions of time. My question or concern around that is that we're still seeing a number of applications, at least for the next 6 to 12 months, that have been assessed by council pre-built form policy, and that this would, for the next, I'd suggest, year approximately, given that, you know, building licences, etc., and sometimes these applications take time to process, that at least for the next year we would still be having approvals of extension of time of developments that have been approved prior to the built form policy. So personally I don't support that for the here and now. I can give some examples of where assessments have been made against the built form policy that haven't satisfied me, either at DAP or at council. So my preference would be that we review that in 12 months' time, where we're much less likely to see applications coming through for extension of time that haven't been originally assessed by council under the built form policy. So I did intend to have an amendment on the table, but wasn't able to get that happening in time. So that would be my preference, and that would be something that I would prefer to see with these delegations. So just putting that out there. Councillor Hallett.
Can I move that we amend as per the Mayor's suggestion?
Well, just to help you out, it's on page 31 of the report, delegation 6.2, number 19, and it would be to delete the words Sorry, I thought it was page 31, but now it's not appearing to be page 31. Page 34. Thank you, Councillor Toppelberg. Page 34. Page 37, actually. 19. Amendment to an application previously determined by council, full stop, and deleting the words except if it is an application to extend the period within which the development must be substantially commenced.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think we have that. We're just typing it up at the moment. So,
thank you. So, Councillor Hallett, you are moving the amendment. Do I have a seconder for the amendment? Councillor Fotakis. Councillor Hallett, do you wish to speak to the amendment? Councillor Fotakis, do you wish to speak to it? Councillor Toppelberg.
Just a question through you to the director. Assuming it would need to be advertised, the DA would need to be advertised in any event. What's the time and what are the implications for administration for, in terms of reporting to council for a time extension, and potentially the time implication for the applicant?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the application will still be determined within the statutory time frame. the 90-day statutory timeframe, given it will be advertised in all likelihood. There may be some applications that won't be advertised because they weren't advertised initially, and they were there's the potential for that, and they'll still be determined within the 60-day statutory timeframe. So I think all in all, it probably won't have a huge impact on the timeframes. It will obviously add some time, maybe a few weeks to that process. Given the applicants are seeking a time extension, it shouldn't have a significant impact on their proposal and the timing of their proposal.
Councillors? Councillor Kondrashevsky?
Look, I take your point. You've triggered my memory in relation to some recent decisions, but I mean, overall, I feel there's reasonable guidance as to what is meant to be assessed in this instance. However, I think I'm supportive as long as we review in 12 months with a view of, probably, I was going to say getting rid of the deletion or putting it back in 12 months' time if the review proves favourable.
Councillors, any further comments? Councillor Fotakis?
Just one
hang on,
question
Councillor Fotakis, were you the seconder?
Yeah, I was.
You were.
Sorry.
But you can ask a question. Yes, that's fine.
Just through you, Mayor Cole, to the Director, just with regards to the amount of applications that are through the pipeline that we could reasonably expect to be affected by this, do we have any idea of really what we're talking about in terms of numbers?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I don't have a number that I can give you. I haven't sat down and done or put those numbers together. I think Council's probably got a good idea given what they see each month, because all of those applications are currently being presented to Council. So I don't think it's a huge number. One or two a month at the most, yeah.
Any further comments on the amendment? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour of the amendment? All those against? No, everyone was voting in favour. Carried. Thank you. Back to the substantive. Any further comments in relation to the delegations? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare it carried unanimously. Thank you. Okay, on to our second item for the evening, which is item 6.1, appointment of a CEO performance review consultant. Can I just have a mover and a seconder? Moved, Councillor Loden. Seconded, Councillor Kondrashevsky.
I won't labour the point here. I'm part of the panel, and we had a discussion, and so I'm supportive of the recommendation. I think the person doing this work did a great job last time round and will do a great job again this time.
Councillor Kondrashevsky, any further comments or questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
I just think it's prudent to make some comment about the validity of a CEO performance review short time before the CEO departs, and that was discussed both with the CEO and with the panel and myself with the Mayor, and it's not just about, whilst it is obviously the individual's performance review, given the nature of the organisation and the way that we exist under the Act, it's a critical opportunity for us as an organisation and the Council as a group to have that dialogue directly with administration and to look at some of those administrative functions, and it also provides opportunity to set out KPIs for the future of the organisation, and those are critical opportunities, and the CEO has agreed as well. And just if you think of it in the legal obligation aside, if you think of it the other way, if we were to decide not to do it by the time somebody was new in the role and we got to a stage of review, we'd be looking at nearly 3 years before Council actually had a role to formally review the CEO's performance and get that critical look at the organisation and administration through that process. So, I think it's just, I suppose, appropriate to make that comment that it's a critical part of what we do, and appreciate the CEO viewing it through that lens. No pun intended.
Councillors, any further comments? Just to say, reiterate Councillor Toppelberg's comments, and thank you for raising that and highlighting that this evening. All right, I'll put it. All those in favour? Declare it carried unanimously. That being our final item of business for the special council meeting, I declare the meeting closed at 6:32 p.m. Thank you.